So I'm going to get started. We have a small group to begin with, but hopefully other folks will join. So this session is titled The Importance of Integrated Campus Student Supports to Serve Adult Education ESL Students. And I am Amy Brown. I'm a research associate at the Community College Research Center. I've been working there about 8 years. I conduct a lot of research directly with community colleges. A small set of that work has been with the adult education ESL programs at City Colleges of Chicago. I also do research about teaching and learning and developmental education, among other topics. I just wanted to share that I haven't publicly presented on this topic before, so I really welcome your reflections on what's most relevant and helpful from it. And this is a small study that's part of a larger project. And so I put some links in the chat, which are other publications in the broader project. And just so you know, this slide deck is currently the best resource for the findings that I'm going to share today. And so I will upload this as a PDF in the conference app, and it will be also available on our center's website. And I don't have other colleagues here at COABE, so I'm managing the presenting, the chat, the Q&A on my own. So please excuse me if I have to take an extra moment to take care of that. And please feel free to communicate in the chat and unmute yourself at various points if you have questions or comments. I also included some photos throughout the presentation. This photo is from City Colleges of Chicago's monthly newsletters. And then I also included some photos that my research team took when we went on site visits to city colleges. So just to start, in the chat, could you introduce yourself, just your name, your role, and your institution so that we know who's here? I'll give folks a moment to do that. If it's easier to unmute, you're also welcome to unmute. I think I may just have enabled that, getting used to some of the controls here, but if you're welcome to unmute and introduce yourself. Thank you, Bill, for the introduction. Other folks, as you have time, please feel free to let me know who's in the room so I can try to be responsive. And there will be a few different opportunities where folks can jump in to a discussion. I'd really appreciate hearing your perspectives. I think I'm going to share some examples from the context that I learned most from, which is City Colleges of Chicago, but there may be similar challenges, approaches that you're using in your own context, and it would be helpful to kind of build out a broader picture. Okay, so just to move into why I'm speaking on this today, and why supports for adult education ESL students are important in community college programs. So I guess the context that I do most of my research in is community colleges, and then we've looked at adult education programs and specifically ESL within that context. We know that these programs strive to offer students several supports to help them engage in complex language learning. And we know that in higher ed, generally, it's really hard to connect students with the resources they need. And that can be even more challenging for students who are learning English, students who are in adult education. And there are lots of disconnections between the adult education programs housed within community colleges and the larger community college context that they're in. We know adult education students are underserved. We know there's resource limitations. And we know that there's a lot of wraparound supports that could benefit these students, but they usually fall outside of what federal funds allow the programs to cover. And we also know that there are a lot of avenues of support that have been cut or at risk of being cut in the current political context. And so trying to think creatively about where those supports can come from. is important, and trying to make use of the resources that are already at community colleges and that may be available to your adult ed students is key. So I'm going to focus on 4 challenges that came up in the research that we conducted to providing those supports through college-wide support programs. And I'm going to share 3 promising approaches that community colleges are using to better serve these students. And I'm going to really focus on concrete, actionable examples throughout. So again, I welcome that folks can unmute and really speak from your own experience, but I'm really curious for folks who are working at or working with adult ed ESL programs based at community colleges. Are your students permitted to access some of the college-wide student services? Curious which services they can access, and then what are the biggest service gaps that your students experience? If folks would rather I present, I can keep going, but I did want to give folks a chance if you'd like to introduce yourself or just speak a little bit about your context and what brought you to this session, what you're interested in supporting students with further. I'd really love to hear it. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but really please, since there's a small group of us, feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in. Oh, sorry. Bill, I'm going to look at the chat for one moment. Okay, so your comment is that for your students, they operate as full level students despite being no cost and non-credit. That said, they're supported by case managers directly in our program. They utilize the community college support if and when they enroll. Could you clarify what that means? Does that mean that they're only able to use the community college supports once they become a credit community college student? Okay, no problem, Bill. It's okay. It sounds like, yeah, okay. You can take your time. You can take your time. Saw a couple folks joined. Let's see. Right now, folks are responding to a question about whether your adult education ESL students are allowed to access college-wide community service, college-wide student services at the community college if you're in a community college-based program. And Bill is sharing that those students don't access advising, the adult ed students don't access advising because case managers cover that area, but they're otherwise able to access other student services like food bank, parent support, counseling, health services. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. If other folks would like to share what services their students are allowed to access or any service gaps, please feel free. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but please jump in to either the chat or unmute at various points. But Bill, it sounds like your context is fairly similar to the context that I have worked with in city colleges of Chicago in terms of they can access most services at the institution. They have transition specialists who I think maybe are similar to your case managers in terms of the what we might call advising support, but otherwise they engage with other departments. So I'm going to give a little bit of context about the adult education ESL programs at City Colleges of Chicago. So they have about 19,000 adult education students. This is as of 2024, and we conducted most of our research in 2023 and 2024. So most students, as in many adult ed programs, most of those students are in ESL, and there are a smaller number in high school equivalency. And then when you look across the institutions at City Colleges of Chicago, there are 6 colleges that offer adult ed ESL, and at 3 of those colleges, there are a really large proportion of the enrollees. So at Truman, they enroll more adult ed students than credit students, actually. So their entire student population is predominantly adult ed. And then at Daly College, they enroll 35% adult ed, and Wright enrolls similarly about 35%. And the remaining colleges that we did research with enroll about 20% of their entire population in adult ed. Like I said, they're offered at 6 colleges and then several satellite campuses and offsite locations that are associated with those colleges. The courses are free. Students can take them in in-person, online, or hybrid modalities. And like in many programs, students are taking a placement test and then enrolling at the NRS levels 1 through 6. So our research team is composed of about 6 people, and we conducted research with city colleges really starting in 2020, but this data collection focuses on a more recent set in 2023 and 2024. I put a green box around the data that's most relevant for this presentation about student supports. We did not, so let me see, there's 144 people kind of captured in this green box. All of their interviews did not necessarily pertain to this research question, but that's the broader group of people we spoke to across several research questions. And this study was entirely qualitative. We also did federal and state policy work. We also did a literature review, and those are linked in the chat. And then we did admin data analyses, which are part of another report that has to do with city colleges programs. So this study focused on 2 research questions. The first, what do college-wide student services department staff and adult ed ESL students identify as challenges for those departments surface to adult ed students? So we were trying to we know that the adult ed program itself provides several supports to students, but when they're in a community college setting, what are the additional supports that they can gain access to just by virtue of the adult ed program being housed in a community college? And then second, what are innovative approaches that those college-wide student services departments are using in terms of programming, staffing, and other supports to serve adult ed ESL students better? So kind of tying back to what you were talking about, Bill, in terms of the types of services that students have access to, I tried to detail pretty comprehensively what kinds of services adult education ESL students do have access to at city colleges. And this is as of our data collection, which was a few years ago. So I can't speak to any potential changes that may have taken place in more recent years. But they, at that time, had access to various types of academic support, accessibility services, advising, and that was partially through transition specialists, which is a specialized role at city colleges, but they could also speak to credit advisors if it was relevant for their transition. Variety of basic needs supports, bus passes, career services, including some industry-specific employment guidance based on their legal status, citizenship classes, counseling services, basically different supports to evaluate their credentials and licenses from other countries. They could receive laptops and other supplies, go to the library, get specialized support based on their visa or legal document status, and obtain different supports for undocumented students, including social opportunities. So I'm going to share a little bit about what support students actually use. This data is actually not from my kind of sub-study. This is from a survey that was administered a couple of years before and was published in a different report, which again is linked on this slide in the chat for this session. So you're welcome to access it. But this survey did ask about adult ed students' use of particular supports. So I wanted to kind of bring it in to complement other qualitative data that we have here. But this reflects about 450 students in non-credit ESL courses. They reported, so the question was, tell us about the resources you have used outside of your class at the college during this academic year. About 41% of students said that they used the tutoring center. About 30% of students said they used technology supports, and about 14% said they used the advising office. And so this indicates that this is across the 6 campuses that offer adult ed, and just shows that there is at least good uptake of tutoring and tech support, and some of these other resources may be less used. And it may indicate that they may not know about how to use some of these other resources as well. So to complement those survey findings, when we asked students in focus groups about what their use of supports were, they really first said their instructors and asking their instructors about supports. And their instructors would refer them to various places, but often the first person they were speaking to was their instructor. And then they mentioned the tutoring center, the food pantry, and the wellness center. And the wellness center, I think, has a lot of counseling services housed in there, and potentially some healthcare, but it seemed to have more of a counseling focus. Students, when we asked where do you find support, they also talked about ways that they support each other. So this is a quote from one student who said, "We have a support group in the back." This is referring to in the back of their class. "I noticed we have a classmate who struggles or feels shame when she speaks, so I say speak louder. We all speak Spanish. If there's a word we don't understand, one of us will say the meaning. For example, table, mesa. I think it's helpful that almost all of us speak the same language." So beyond just the college communicating about various resources, students really build community and lean on each other. So I'm going to kind of briefly move through 4 challenges that came up most frequently when we asked folks working in different college-wide student services offices what was challenging about providing those supports to adult ed ESL students or tailoring those supports to these students' needs. So this is likely not comprehensive of the challenges that are experienced, but they are the most commonly brought up ones, and I really encourage any other ideas about important challenges that come up in your context, and I'll give time for that after I walk through these. So first challenge is there's limited collaboration between the adult ed program and the college-wide student services departments. This is not surprising. We know that the community college and the various programs that they offer, and then the adult education program, they have different funding streams, different accountability requirements, different missions. And they were kind of brought together, not at the same time. Adult ed programming really came out in the 60s, and then community colleges grew into serving a large number of students in communities as an open access space, and then adult education programs moved into those settings in some states, and they kind of live under the same roof but have a lot of different rules that they have to follow and a lot of policy differences. So it makes sense that they don't always collaborate. In the Chicago context, we really saw that There was varied levels of collaboration across campuses, and many campuses said we do not. The college-wide student services departments don't work directly with adult education. We've found that they didn't know what each other's offerings were, and a lot of the college-wide student services departments didn't know the adult education ESL students well. And adult education instructors can be limited in their knowledge of the college-wide offerings. A lot of adult education instructors in this particular context in city colleges of Chicago work part-time, a maximum of 24 hours. They might work across multiple campuses. They may not have a physical office that is their own. And so they may not know a lot about the college context that they're working in. And so if they don't know a lot, then it's just more limited what they're able to share with their students. The second challenge is that the staff in college-wide student services departments may not speak the languages reflected in the adult education ESL program, and they have real time capacity constraints. So there's a lot of staff turnover, and that really impacts delivery and it impacts relationships that students have with college staff. There are some departments that only have one or two staff people. Let's say an accessibility office, they may only have one staff person, and it may be very hard for them to tailor their services to particular student groups, with adult education ESL students being one of those groups. Second, the typical delivery hours for services, like advising, tutoring, etc., typically 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And a lot of adult education courses take place in the evening, so students just may not be in the same place. They may not be on campus during those daytime hours to be able to access those services. And then third, when you look across college departments, so this is again like outside of adult education ESL, the other college-wide student support departments, they typically have a limited number of bilingual or multilingual staff, and it's challenging to hire and recruit and hire more staff. Community colleges already have challenges hiring folks because the pay is not very high, and folks who are bilingual or multilingual, the positions just might not be competitive with other opportunities that folks might have. Having a lack of bilingual and multilingual college department staff really can exacerbate students' hesitancy to ask for help, and they might view asking for help as a sign of weakness and just may not be able to build a rapport with the staff in those departments. And then in this context, again, so in Illinois, there is state policy mandating that each community college has an undocumented student liaison. But those folks, they carry out really important work with the undocumented student populations on their campuses, but they also hold full-time roles with other responsibilities. So they are not a full-time undocumented student liaison. And so they have limited capacity to conduct outreach broadly across the college, and therefore don't have a lot of capacity to have targeted work with adult education ESL students, though those students can seek out the liaison if they know about seeking it out, but they're not broadly interacting with the adult education student body. The third challenge that came up in our study is really that adult education ESL students are simply not eligible for some services at the college, or those services really in their design and delivery were built for US foreign credit students. So when we looked at what the requirements were for different grants, federal funding, or scholarships, most of them were specified for credit students. So students who were in adult education were not able to obtain those. There were transportation support and accessibility accommodations, but they often required different documents that adult education students may not have. And then when you look at the services that are carried out through career services, They may not have the skill set and knowledge base to serve what the career services needs are for undocumented students, um, or some industry specific guidance about if they can be hired in a particular industry given their legal status, and if they may need guidance on how to file an I-10 or establish their own company or LLC if their industry would require that rather than them seeking a more typical job. So um, services don't necessarily take their needs into account, the current college-wide services. And then a fourth challenge that was brought up is that there's limited tracking of adult education students' use of college services. So colleges have really limited ability to know whether students use these services, what their use looks like. And the data systems that track student usage don't usually distinguish between adult education and credit. This might be different in your context. I'm not sure. There were some staff that were talking about some use of manual flags to indicate when a student who was being served was adult ed, but all staff weren't consistently using that, and it took extra time. And we know that this just kind of fits into a broader picture of adult education data collection being uneven, broadly speaking, beyond the skills gains that have to be reported federally. A lot of information about course enrollments, persistence, and progress is difficult to obtain and measure. Students' placement score might not exactly match the course that they end up enrolling in. There's a lot of discrepancies that can come up, and then it's just really challenging to be able to look carefully at how well students are serving this population. So I'm going to try to have a discussion again. Folks can either type in the chat or unmute. I'm just really wondering if any of these challenges resonate with you in your context, if you're in an adult education ESL context in a community college, or any challenges that our study just didn't really cover that you feel like is really important for your context. So I'll mute for a moment and give folks time to either type a response or jump into the conversation. Would anyone like to jump in? Okay, there's going to be a couple more times. Oh, thank you, Bill. I'll just read your response. Bill wrote, "You're right, this data supports our student experience." He's trying to think of anything else that might be outside of what I shared, but so far it's reassuring to know we're not alone. Yeah, I think there's a lot of common common experiences that folks in adult education programs have in the community college context. There's a lot of opportunities in this space, so I don't want to discount that, but the challenges are real, just like the challenges that exist for community college students can be even further exacerbated for the students in the adult ed programs. Thanks, Bill, for engaging in the chat. If anyone else would like to share their thoughts at any point, please feel free. I'm going to keep moving through though. Okay, so I'm going to pivot from the challenges to three approaches that we really saw in our site visits and interviews. And those approaches really seem to be better supporting adult education ESL students. And so I'm trying in this section to really give clear, concrete examples. In some cases, I may be sharing the extent of the information that I know about that example, but I really welcome any questions about elaboration where I can elaborate what those how those examples may have come about, and I can also try to connect folks to city colleges if you'd like more information about them. These approaches, I'm attempting to tie some of them to the challenges, but I'll show that some of the challenges are still not well addressed. So the first approach that we observed is really efforts to increase adult education instructors' knowledge of college-wide and community-based services. We know that these instructors were the most common folks that students went to help connect them to different services. And we heard about examples of student services departments offering professional development for adult education instructors. So the undocumented student liaisons carried out an undocumented student services training so that instructors were more aware of issues and challenges that undocumented students face, and could try to create classroom spaces that were safer for them, and try to connect them to the college resources that would be most helpful in a kind of open way without students feeling at risk. And we heard about plans for Disability Access Center staff to carry out trainings about disability laws and regulations so that students could try to access different services in the adult ed context through the accessibility office. So both of those examples are just trying to heighten instructors' awareness of supports and help them be a good bridge for students to connect directly with those supports. We just know that instructors need to know about the supports, be encouraged to share about them in class, and if it's possible, to bring the supports into or closer to the classroom setting. So it could be bringing tutors from the tutoring center into an embedded tutor role in an adult education class. That may or may not be possible in your context, but that was one strategy that folks were using in city colleges. So I'm going to share a couple of quotes and then an example that really tie back to this first approach of increasing adult ed instructors' knowledge of these services. So a student said, "The second day I attended classroom with my teacher, she made a tour of the whole college to explain everything that the college has." And so the student really felt like their awareness of the college and the resources were facilitated through their teacher giving a tour. And then another student said, "I talk with my teacher because she knows my case, she knows what level I am, and she even told us about the tutoring, but she always stayed there saying, 'Oh no, please relax and calm down. Don't make this quick. Stay here. You don't have to be expert right now, but you're going to get it. Then take your time. Don't get frustrated. And we can continue.' That's why we're still here in adult ESL. So adult education ESL. So this quote was really the instructor both encouraging students to go to tutoring, but also saying, you don't have to be an expert at English right now. It takes time, it takes practice. Try to stick with it. Really draw upon the resources that are here, both the instructor and different academic supports at the college. And so the students seem to be kind of encouraged and relieved by what the instructor was saying about making use of these services. And then this was one concrete example that we observed in a classroom. So this was a level 1 class where so the instructor was teaching several newcomers, all of whom were from Spanish-speaking countries. And so he had a lesson where they were introducing vocabulary related to neighborhoods and then also vocabulary related to transportation. And he was teaching in a bilingual manner. So he was sharing some content in English in terms of the vocabulary, and then explaining in some cases in Spanish. And so when he was speaking about neighborhoods, he talked about practical resources to help students access housing in the community and in Chicago specifically. And then when he was introducing vocabulary about transportation, he was speaking to students about the process for undocumented immigrants and non-citizens to obtain an Illinois driver's license. So he was giving really concrete information that would help students settle into the community, be able to get around, and really contextualizing that within the vocab lesson that they were engaged in that evening's course. So the second approach was really to increase hiring of staff and instructors who share the language backgrounds represented in each college's adult education ESL program. And I'll note that in this research context of City Colleges of Chicago, the adult education student population can vary quite significantly from neighborhood to neighborhood. And so the staff languages that need to be represented in different communities can differ from one institution to the other. So we know that this is important because it helps to increase students' understanding of what the resources are. If you can speak fluently with a student about the resource, you can explain it more thoroughly. And it just generally fosters relationships across the college. It's really key that folks are multilingual. It was also voiced that it was important when students had prior experience as an ESL student, sometimes as an adult education ESL student in this context. And then prior experience working with ESL students was really valued by both fellow staff and students. Spanish-speaking adult education ESL students voiced in several focus groups that it was really helpful to them to have bilingual staff people in different college departments. And we heard that at Truman College, they had tutoring center staff who spoke Arabic, French, and Spanish. And then Malcolm X College had recently hired a Spanish-speaking career services director, and that person had begun offering resume workshops in Spanish. And they had worked to translate their career services materials into Spanish and Polish, and had a staff person lead a workshop about a community health worker program that was being carried out in Spanish. So again, like sharing information so students can really grasp what their offerings are. I'm going to share a couple of concrete examples from the colleges. So at Olive Harvey College, the tutoring center staff were really working to identify ways to better serve its growing Haitian student population, and they had an absence of readily available interpretation services for those students. So the tutoring center submitted a request to have a higher placed adult education ESL student who speaks Haitian Creole be hired as an embedded tutor for the lower level classes. So this was really looking at what's the knowledge, resources, expertise, assets of our students, and how can they help bolster the supports within our program and help students be able to give back to the program. This is a very similar example, but at Truman College, where they have a highly diverse student population. Like I mentioned earlier, their campus is predominantly adult education students, and of those students, they're predominantly ESL students. And so they really needed more, they continue to need more staff who speak the languages reflected in their student population. And so their career services staff person described being able to refer adult education ESL students enrolled in higher level courses for full-time jobs on campus. And so she said they were looking for students to work as translators in this department. I would just like to see more diverse students working here that are coming up through adult ed. And maybe this isn't exactly where they want to wind up, but it's certainly a very good place for them to start. And this is another similar example, but at Daly College, they kind of each have a slightly different flavor to them. But this challenge was their college community was experiencing a lot of new immigrants coming in who needed some English language supports before they even started their formal adult education coursework. And so their instructor set up an opportunity for a Spanish-speaking adult education ESL student to help in an introductory English class as a teaching assistant before those students enrolled. And so that student said, as a student, that helped us to practice. And my teacher today mentioned that we want to visit some classes this semester to help another teacher, and that's going to build us up, right? I like that. So she was emphasizing that this experience like helps her to practice her English skills, but also gets to help these new folks coming into the community. And so these last three examples really affirm the linguistic assets that adult education ESL students have and show ways that staff can really present these students with opportunities to gain professional experience at the college and contribute to other adult education students' learning and their success. So the third approach to really help connect adult education ESL students with supports either at the community or at the college is really developing intentional partnerships with community-based organizations that address knowledge or capacity gaps at the college. So one district-wide example of this was that the City Colleges of Chicago are holding regular gatherings that bring together the staff from the adult education programs across campuses with leaders of several community-based organizations across Chicago. And so these really enable folks to build relationships, market the City College's adult education programs and the other programs to the community, and identify community-based services that would benefit the adult education students. Because we really know that the community college can only do so much to address some needs that adult education ESL students might bring. So really making use of these strategic partnerships is important. So when we were visiting city colleges, we went there for 2 different weeks at 2 points in time in 2023. It happened to coincide with one of these meetings where they were bringing together adult ed folks with community-based organizations. And so we went to this community leaders breakfast hosted at Kennedy King College. The orange circle at the bottom is just one of my colleagues who happens to be at a table that got photographed in the newsletter, but it was a really neat event. There were a lot of tables where several organizations set up and shared brochures and spoke about their services, and city colleges also got to present on their programming. Part of addressing some of the gaps that community colleges provide in terms of services is that they also made key partnerships for career readiness that serve immigrant and refugee students. And so they partnered with Upwardly Global, which is a national nonprofit, and that provides immigrant and refugee professionals with job coaching and career training. They also had American Job Center outreach to adult education students. And they worked with Scale It, which is a Chicago-based nonprofit that receives many referrals from the Illinois Department of Employment Security. And they have career navigators who offer clients and those could be clients in city colleges of Chicago, as well as community-based organizations. They provide them with adult education ESL options, and they provide some limited case management and connection to social services. Finally, within this approach of thinking about partnerships that community colleges can build to better support their adult education ESL students, there's an interesting challenge that comes up when adult education ESL students take their classes at satellite campuses or offsite locations, because they have less access to the college-wide student services. They're not usually housed at those locations in as robust of a way as they are at the main campuses. And so sometimes they have to get creative, and sometimes the offsite locations provide new opportunities. And so one location that we were able to visit is called Onward Neighborhood House. It's an offsite location that offers the adult education ESL courses, but then it also provides a really wide variety of social services to students. Those include citizenship classes, community health services, computer literacy classes, and free use of computers. They have early childhood programs, a food pantry, home-based programs for expectant mothers and parents, an immigrant refugee welcome center, and supports for small business owners. And so there can be new opportunities and new ways for students to benefit from other community services through their coursework at these other locations. So I just spoke about three approaches. First approach was increasing adult education instructors' knowledge of college and community services, increasing hiring of staff who share language backgrounds represented in the adult ed program, and developing intentional partnerships with community-based organizations that address knowledge or capacity gaps. There are a few areas that seem also important, but there weren't as robust examples from our conversations with folks at city colleges to really say that they were a fully built out approach. But I wanted to list them here because I think they are really important. And so I'd like to highlight them. So the first is that it is really hard to facilitate intentional collaboration between adult education and college-wide student services departments, but that's really foundational to a lot of the other approaches being carried out that I mentioned already. So we had one example of an adult education associate dean who held a meeting involving college student services staff, adult education staff, and adult education instructors to discuss student needs and supports. And we spoke to a student services staff member who went to that meeting, and they really said that it was the first meeting they had experienced of its kind, and it really helped to open a line of communication between adult education faculty and student services staff. But that's something that needs to be maintained for it to be really helpful in the long term. Second point here is that there's a lot of changing political and education conditions that are directly impacting adult education students. And so it remains important to kind of revisit regularly what are the needs that adult education ESL students have and how can we better develop supports for them. So not just saying, what are the supports we already have? How can we connect them to adult ed students, but seeing what are the new needs that are emerging. The third item is about developing services that help these students really visualize their goals and see their progress through support for education, career, and financial planning. And this is important because we want students to see adult education as part of their path toward their broader goals. And so creating opportunities for them to sit down and reflect on that and gain support to see how the community college might be part of the path toward their goals, whether it's transitioning into a career program, into a credit program, into other offerings at the community college. We'd like to make sure that students have those opportunities ahead of them and know about them as much as possible. A few examples that I shared really had examples of staff people noticing when students had really clear knowledge assets and skills that could be kind of brought back into the program to strengthen it and strengthen the experience of other ESL students. And so further kind of looking for opportunities to do that is really important. And then when adult education ESL students know more about services, can carry out some of those services, that just helps the broader communication and awareness of those services throughout the adult education student body. This was implied a little bit in some earlier examples as well, but just increasing the visibility of support services, bringing them closer to the instructional setting, dedicated tutoring, and English as a second language cafes for informal language practice, just setting up those kinds of spaces for students. And then when thinking about how basic needs supports are being communicated, as much as possible, communicating that in students' native languages as well as English is really important for their awareness. So I shared 3 different approaches, and then I shared some emerging areas. I just have this question here about which of these approaches, if any, would you prioritize, or if there are any areas that came up in this discussion that seem especially important or even seem like low-hanging fruit to pursue first to really help build bridges between college-wide student services supports and then what adult education ESL students might benefit from most. So this can be kind of like a take home question or reflection once you're looking back at the slides. If you want to unmute, you're welcome to. I know we just have one person in the session right now, so it's okay. Either way, you can speak to this. And then just in general, if there's any questions or comments, I welcome them at this time. And I have a few other relevant publications that I put in the chat earlier, and you'll be able to access from the slide deck later on that share relevant publications. So we have this first study, which was to our understanding, the first systematic literature review of adult education ESL, and we looked at community college contexts. Within that, this report focuses on our research from City Colleges of Chicago, but does not discuss as much what I shared today. And then this report is a policy report that focuses on federal and state policy in the provision of adult education ESL in community colleges. So all of them have a tie to what I've been speaking about today. Do you have any questions in the meantime? If not, it's okay. I'm also accessible via email if you would like to ask, or if folks watching this recording would like to ask at a later time, please reach out. But I really appreciate folks that were able to join and hope you're having a great time at the conference and have learned a lot from various sessions. So thank you.